Good morning, Monday School. I am coming to you this week with our third lesson on David, and it's titled Sowing the Seeds of Jealousy. We're going to look today at 1 Samuel chapter 18 through 21. Now, last week we had all kinds of excitement. We had giant slings, and we had anointings, and we had some harp playing. This week, a little bit different vibe going on. We are going to really look at a bunch of things in David's life that all start with M's. As a teacher, I like alliteration. We're going to look at musketeers, master plans, marriages, messages, madmen, and mayhem. Sounds like an awful lot to get done in like 20 minutes, but I'm going to try. So, where we are right now is David has just killed Goliath, and he has been brought into Saul's court and kind of promoted. He was a part-time armor bearer, part-time musician, and he has been promoted to one of the military leaders for Saul. But Saul has an issue. Saul brings him in with the wrong motivation. He is under the impression that you can keep your enemies closer to kind of keep an eye on them. He's very jealous. Now, Saul in the past has had a problem with three things: with fear, with anger, and with jealousy. And we're going to see those things really come to a head today and continue to kind of drive Saul off the deep end. So let's go ahead and pick it up. 1 Samuel 18, verse 1 through 9, I'm calling musketeers, because that's the first glimpse we see of Jonathan and David. Now, Jonathan and David are in some ways very similar. They are both young men. They're both warriors. They both trust the Lord for their victories. They're both godly. But one big difference: Jonathan is the heir to the throne. David has been anointed to be the heir to the throne. So that is the biggest difference. If you wanted to go back and look at Jonathan a little bit, 1 Samuel 14 really gives you some insight on Jonathan's character. He has that kind of absolute faith that we see in David when he goes into the Philistine camp by himself with his armor bearer and doesn't take no for an answer. A lot like David does with his absolute faith. Both of them say that victory is through God as well. So you can go back. But at the beginning, we see this really beautiful symbolic thing that Jonathan does. And he lays down his garments before David, and he lays down his weapons before David as a show of a covenant of friendship. I'm going to pause there because I want to go into that covenant later on. But I just want you to see that there's a little glimpse of a very special friendship kindling here between the two of them. So the rest of chapter 18, 1 through 9, is just people falling in love with David. Women singing songs about him. People that he's working with in the field who are saying he's such a skilled strategist. And every time he does something, it prospers. And that prosperity brings popularity. And that also brings Saul a little cuckoo, because Saul is driven by his reputation. And we saw that 2 weeks ago, when even after he knows he's no longer going to be the king, he asked Samuel to go make it look good for him. So Saul is burning on the inside, and I said this already, with three things: jealousy, anger, and fear. So we're going to pick that up in 1 Samuel 18. I'm going to read just a little bit. I'm going to read chapter 9 to talk about his jealousy. So chapter 18, verse 9, says, Saul looked at David with suspicion from that day on. Suspicion, little bit of jealousy. Don't know what's going on there. And then in verse 15 it says, Saul saw that he was prospering greatly, and he dreaded him. Ladies, sometimes I struggle a little with jealousy. Not with my husband, but like when people get recognition at work, and I'm like, but I'm a good teacher. But this is something different. He dreads him. He cannot even look at him without obsessing. Okay, anger. Verse 11 gives us his anger, and we see this a couple times in Saul. Saul hurled a spear, for he thought, I will pin David to the wall. But David escaped. Doesn't even think. He lets his anger drive his actions. The Hebrew word for anger here is charah, Charah, charah. And it means to burn, to kindle, to glow with anger, to grow indignant. It actually kind of refers to a fire, not a good fire, or the heat of anger in the moment. It is when somebody explodes or ignites with anger. When you're no longer thinking, you just act. And his action is throwing some spears. So we've seen before that he has an anger management issue. And we're going to see now, every time that David is in his presence, there's an issue. Because once that anger starts working, you can't just turn it off. Once that fire's burning, you can't stop it. And then the third thing that motivates him is fear. And this is verse 12 of 18. Now Saul was afraid of David, for the Lord was with him, but had departed from Saul. So he's not afraid of David's military prowess. He's not even really afraid of his popularity. But he's afraid of the favor that is on David's life. He understands that David's got something he'll never get back. And that's where his fear comes from. So Paul, in his kind of wisdom, promotes a plan. He's going to make David look bad. Anytime we start to put somebody else down and we are trying to make somebody else look bad, we need to know that's not rooted in the right motivation. So he comes up with this master plan in 18:12 through 16. He demotes him. All right, I'm going to show you. You're not going to get to be the military leader you want. He promotes him to a captain of only 1,000 men. David could have been really like, what did I do? What are you doing? Or mad. But David goes out and serves with excellence in his humility. And it makes Saul even more upset because he doesn't have the jealousy issue and the anger issue that Saul has. He doesn't have to have the reputation. And I think part of that is because of where he comes from. Who's he going to have the reputation before earlier? The sheep? So he goes out and it says that he does everything with excellence, with an excellent reputation, even though he's demoted. And then the second thing as part of this plan is, if you remember when he said to David, hey, if you defeat this Philistine, I'm going to give you great wealth. Oh, and you get to marry one of my girls. So David is promised the hand of the princess Merab, Merab. And Saul brings her out and says, this is going to be your wife. And David is humbled. And he goes, who am I that I should be your son-in-law? I'm just a simple shepherd. And this is going to start spinning a little bit in Saul's mind. But he changes his mind. Saul's like, just kidding. And he takes the offer of Merab and he gives her away to another man. And this is verse 17 said, Saul said to David, here's my daughter. I will give her to you as a wife. Only be a valiant man and fight for me in the Lord's battles. So he says, you know what? You don't need to give me anything. Just keep fighting for me. And then in 19, Saul's daughter should have been given to David, but she was given to Adriel the Mechalethite for a wife. Just randomly, no explanation. Up, given to somebody else. Her name, which is kind of interesting, means compensation. She's payment, and he doesn't get his payment. But it doesn't dissuade David. He's still going out, doing his best, and Saul's not done with his master plan. So in 18:20 through 30, his master plan changes a little bit. He notices he has another daughter, Michal, that has a little thing for David. Matter of fact, it said she loved him. But as I was doing some digging, it doesn't mean that she loved him. She loved the idea of him. He's young, he's a warrior, he has my father's attention. She doesn't know at this point in a negative way. And so he says in verse 20 and 21, I'm going to give her to David. Not because David deserves it, but he wants, and he uses the word snare. He's going to trap David with Michal. And so Michal, given to David. And this time when David answers, but who am I? How can I be your son-in-law? He asks for a dowry. He wants payment this time, which is kind of funny because he didn't want payment for the other one. And what he asks, I had to read like 3 times because there's something wrong here. He asks David to go into the Philistine camp and bring him 100 foreskins. He wants parts. He wants proof that David would do anything for him. David has to go by himself with a small group of men to go kill 100 Philistines in their camp and bring back their parts. I'm so glad I didn't have to teach this to little kids. So glad I didn't have to do that. But here's David's reaction in all of this. When the servants told David these words, it pleased David to become the son-in-law before the day had expired. So he went right away. He didn't even wait. David rose up and went, he and his men, and struck down 200 men among the Philistines and brought back the skins. You want 100? Bam! I'm going to bring you 200 without batting an eye. So his plan fails. As a matter of fact, at the end of chapter 18, it says, David behaved as he went out in battle, himself more wisely than all the servants of Saul, so his name was highly esteemed. So it's even better than it was before. So Saul lost it, right? We've already seen him throw a spear once. We know that his life is in danger. So David is trying to figure it out now. How am I going to save myself? He's starting to lean on his own understanding. Danger! Proverbs 3, 5 through 7. Let me read that with you real quick. Watch, I'm never going to get there real quick. And we hear this one a lot about direction. But for David, I think, he's a man of absolute faith. He knows that in the face of any adversity, he has the greatest adversary. He has the greatest answer. So it says in Proverbs 3, 5 through 7, trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your path straight. Do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and turn away from evil. It will be a healing for your body, and it would be refreshment for your bones. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will direct your path. And don't look wise in your own eyes. I think oftentimes when we're trying to figure things out, situations that we're in, problems that we have, we start spinning our own schemes and our own ways of doing things instead of going to the Lord and asking. And David does this, even though we know that he is a man of absolute faith. So he starts having some messengers and messages. And this is chapter 19. All of chapter 19 is these messages and messengers. He actually has 3 messages. The first one is Jonathan. Jonathan knows that his dad is out to kill David, and we've already seen that he has a tender spot for David. So he goes, you know what? Let me go talk to my dad. Let me go intercede with my dad. Let me go stand at his side in the field and talk to him and see if I can get you back in his good graces. And this is in verses 1 through 10 of 1Samuel 19. And he goes and he talks to him and he goes, he's loyal. He's a fierce warrior. He is loyal to you to a fault. He's part of the family. So he spins all these things to Saul. And Saul, for a moment, is like, oh, yeah, no, you're right. I'm going to spare his life. So he brings David back in. And it works for a little bit. And I think it's a lesson for us that we can kind of bind those emotions for a little bit. We can check our own emotions. Saul checked his anger and his fear and his jealousy for a little bit, but only God can heal them. And when we try to put Band-Aids on it, those Band-Aids come off. And that's what happens with Saul. In verse 10, he's sitting there, 9. Now there was an evil spirit from the Lord on Saul as he was sitting in the house with a spear in his hand, and David was playing his harp. Guess what he did? Verse number 10, chuck it again, and tried to pin him, and David escapes. For a little bit, we think that it's going to be okay. So the second message that David gets is he goes to Michal. Michal, his wife, the princess, and Michal has the idea. He said, my dad's trying to kill you. I want to help you escape. It's Michal's idea at the beginning. And she warns him. David already knows this. He's had things thrown at his head. So together they concoct this lie where they take an idol and they put some hair in it and they put it in bed, and David escapes. And Michal is the one that has to sell the lie. And eventually, she said, he's sick. He's not coming to court today. Saul says, go get me the bed. Get me the bed. Get me David. Bring them all here. And then he realizes that were able to deceive him with this idol and some hair. And I think that David starts at this point a slippery slope. He's starting to lie. He started to come up with some schemes, and it's not working out for him. And notice that he goes to an idol as his substitute. Not to the Lord. He goes to an idol. And that's significant. Side note, I was doing some research, and during David's life, the Psalms that he wrote kind of coincide with different parts of it. So for 1 Samuel 19, 1 through 17, there are 2 Psalms. If you want to go back and kind of get his mental or his emotional state, you can look at Psalms 34 and Psalms 59. Both of them show him in a little bit of turmoil. But it's excellent to be able to stop, go and look at these Psalms and go, oh yeah, I can see how this works. So that's Psalms 34 and 59. All right, so we're still on messengers. Our third messenger, he goes to Samuel. Notice that he doesn't go to the priest or to the man of God until after he goes to Jonathan and after he goes to Michal. So he goes to Samuel. Samuel's kind of at his retreat. When I was thinking about it, I was thinking of Star Wars, and he's at his Jedi Academy with the other prophets, and they are practicing. They're prophesying. Now here, it doesn't mean prophesying like what I see in the future, but it's really praising and declaring the word of God. And as he goes, David stays there for a while, and Saul's pursuing him. So Saul sends 3 different sets of people to go get David and bring him back. God's so funny. And this is in verse 18 through 24. Every time one of their groups goes, they get caught up in the spirit of the prophecy, and it's irresistible. They are led into prophesying, and they don't leave. So first group goes, doesn't come back. Second group goes, doesn't come back. Third group doesn't come back. So Saul goes himself. And this is an interesting picture for me because Saul goes with the intention of getting David to kill him. And when he gets close enough to where they're prophesying, he is overcome by the Spirit. To the point where he lays down his robes. It says he's naked, but he's not like butt naked. But he's naked of all of his royal garments, and he's probably just in a tunic. And he lays prostrate on the ground, and he starts prophesying. The Lord's Spirit had departed from him already, and this is a taste of the irresistible Spirit of the Lord, and he can't resist it. It allows David to escape. And everybody, for this man who's all about the reputation, looks at him and goes, is that Saul laying on the ground in his underwear? God has the ability to humble people, and it's irresistible. All right, 2 more chapters. We're going to fly because I'm only going to do about 4 more minutes or 5 more minutes. 1 Samuel chapter 20 total is David and Jonathan coming up with a master plan. David's in survival mode. He's already lied. He's already started to come up with his own schemes. And he goes to Jonathan, his best friend. It says they are knitted at the soul. They have an uncommon friendship. And he starts this conversation with almost like an argument. Your dad is doing this to me. And they come up with these godly men. Don't go to God. They don't pray. They don't seek godly counsel. They just come up with, I got a plan. And the plan, of course, is flawed because they didn't seek the Lord on it. So in verse 1 through 8, Jonathan goes and he lies to his dad. And David's hanging out in a field by a rock. And Jonathan goes to his dad and says he's sick. There's going to be a feast. He can't come to the feast because he's unclean. So the first night it works. The second night, Jonathan says, you know what? I sent him away. He went home to sacrifice. And Saul sees through it. And he becomes enraged. And there's a whole plan that Jonathan's going to shoot some arrows. And if he sends his person to grab the arrow, his fetcher, and he says, the arrow is beyond you, that means you better run. Or if he says the arrow is close to you, that means you can come home. So they make the covenant in verse 9 through 17 that really is the promise that lasts not just their lifetime, but their family's legacy. And it's just a beautiful thing where they just make the promise that they are going to trust each other and share loving kindness regardless. Jonathan knows he's not going to be the king. He's already laid down his royal robe before him and all of his weapons. And this was in 18. He's already laid it before him. He already knows. So there is nothing for Jonathan to gain. So he asks David to protect his family and to show loving kindness to his future generations. That's going to be important in a couple chapters. I want to talk a little bit about the covenant that they made. Every covenant has 3 things. It has a sign, it has a sacrifice, and it has an oath. The sign, if we go back to the Abrahamic covenant in 15, was a flaming torch, where God sends a flaming torch. The sacrifice in a traditional covenant is animals, and then there's an oath. In chapter 15 of Genesis, it was, I'm going to give Abraham the land. David and Jonathan's covenant, the sign was that they were knit in the soul. They knew it. It was an immediate connection. The sacrifice was all on Jonathan's part, where he lays down his robe and his weapons. And the oath here is that there will be protection and loving kindness. So the plan unfolds in verses 18 through 29. And like I said, there was a little bit of lying, there was some missed dinner, and then it backfires in verse 30 and 34. Saul pledges to kill David, and it actually ignites his anger against Jonathan. And at one point, he throws a spear at Jonathan. He's going to kill his own son. He is blinded by his rage. So David and Jonathan say goodbye, and this is very emotional for me. So in verse 20, in chapter 20, verses 41 and 42, they realize that they're no longer going to be in each other's lives. So when the lad was gone, this was the arrow kid, David rose from the south side, fell on his face on the ground, and bowed 3 times. That's a symbol of bowing before royalty. And they kissed each other and wept together, but David wept more. Then Jonathan said to David, go in safety, insomuch as we have sworn to each other in the name of the Lord, saying the Lord will be between me and you, and between my descendants and your descendants forever. It is a bond that is not broken when they leave. They rose and departed, and Jonathan went to the city. This uncommon friendship, in this chapter, they've been able to speak their mind. They were able to argue without the fear of being shut down, and that's in verse 1 through 4 of chapter 20. They were able to share their heart and their tenderness without ridicule, and that's in verse 41. They wept together. And then in 43, they can stay close at a distance. They may never see each other face to face again, but they know that that uncommon friendship continues. All right, here's some friendship things for you to dwell on. John 15:12 through 13 talks about a friend laying down their life for one another. An uncommon friend sacrifices for you. Colossians 3, verses 12 through 14. An uncommon friend bears your burden. And then 1 Thessalonians 5:11. An uncommon friend encourages you. Okay. Think about those. Go and look at them. All right, wrapping up. The last chapter, 1 Samuel 21, is where we see the mayhem. David's lies escalate. He is hot firing lies right now. Once you start, it's easy. Once you start a path of deception, you just want to keep it going. You have to have lies to cover your lies. So he lies to 3 people. Actually lies to 2 people. He lies to a priest called Amalek in verses 1 through 9. He asks for bread. He's given holy bread, God's bread, and he takes it. There are spies there for Saul that are going to come back and haunt him. And then he's given, in verse 8 and 9, the sword of Goliath to protect him from the priest's own sacrificial garments. So, kind of tells us that God hasn't left him. He has given him his provision with his bread, and he has given him his protection with Goliath's sword. Now, this is where David really starts not thinking things through. He takes Goliath's sword and this kind of stolen bread, and he runs into the hands of the enemy. So in verses 10 through 15, he goes to Achish, who is the head of the Philistines. He literally goes into the enemy camp carrying the sword of Goliath, who he just killed and took his sword. He believes that if he is now the enemy of his enemies, that he will be their friend. What? You just killed their champion, and yet here you are showing up like this. Crazy. He realizes immediately, not a good idea. I'm standing here with a weapon. I'm standing in the enemy's camp, and I killed their champion. And the king is losing his mind. So, not the reception he had hoped for in 10 through 12, and he comes up with this idea. I'm just going to hide my sanity. I'm just going to go mad. So in verse 13, it gives us this idea of here's this great warrior, and he is scratching at things, and he is making weird noises, and he's drooling on himself. And then the king's like, crazy man, verse 14 and 15, and sends him away. It's amazing to me, final thought, how David, who is a man of absolute faith, descends to this madness or this mayhem because of fear and unbelief. We see fear at the beginning with Saul. We see fear at the end with David. And when they're acting in fear, either one, they're making really poor decisions. When we lean on ourselves and on our own emotions, we're going to create some mayhem and we fall into it. That's why we are constantly reminded to go to the Lord with our emotions, with our physical needs, with things that are troubling us. Because when we lean on the Lord, we don't have to try and figure things out like David did. Because when we do, we create mayhem. And then God has to help us clean it up. All right, I said there were Psalms references. For this section, the Psalms reference is Psalms 34 and 56. All right, that was a lot. Thank you guys for tuning in and for listening. If you have any feedback or questions, holler at me, and I will bring you a new one next week. God bless. Have a good week. And read 1 Samuel 22 through 25 for your homework. Bye, all.